I'd like to say something about eagles now. One of the questions that I get fairly frequently is, are young eagles the same size as adult eagles? They are. Eagles and all birds, in fact, are what we refer to as determinate growers. That means they're not like fish and they're not like snakes, which grow throughout their lifetime. Birds reach their terminal body size at the time of fledging. And so, in the case of eagles, most of the time, at the point of fledging, they're heavier than the adults are. And that's a fairly common characteristic for large raptors. So they are as big as adults when they're ready to fledge. One of the other interesting things that we see with eagles is delayed plumage maturation. And this bird here is a nestling, and you can see that they're dark there. The plumage is dark all over. With each successive year and each successive molt, they get closer and closer to the adult plumage characteristic that we're familiar with, white head and tail. It's not just the plumage that changes, as you can see here. The young birds have a very dark eye, and as you know, the adults have a yellow iris. There are also changes in the soft tissues and the bill. Let's look at the next image. And here you can see two birds in prime condition. And what always sort of stands out to me is that the bill color oftentimes gives an indication of body condition. The ones that are deep yellow and orange are good condition birds. We'll get sick birds in at times that the yellow is more of a powdery, dry yellow. Those birds aren't in the same condition. So the brightness of these soft tissues, you can see it in the soft tissue around the eye here, you can see it in the iris color, and you can see it in the bill color, tend to be a good indication of condition. One of the other things that we see in this particular species is that there is reverse sexual size dimorphism, meaning that the females are larger than the males, and in fact they're about 30% larger. Let's see the next one. We can see that. This is a group of birds from the Chesapeake Bay area, and it shows the difference in size between the males and females. Males are about 30% larger, so in the Chesapeake Bay, our females tend to weigh about 10 to 12 pounds, whereas the males tend to be about 7 to 8 pounds. There is a latitudinal gradient in body size, so that if we were down in Florida, the birds are much smaller. They're more like red-tail size, but as we get up to the largest population, which is Alaska, those birds might weigh 14, 16 pounds. And so there is a latitudinal gradient in body size, but here at our latitude, that's where they are, we have sexual size dimorphism throughout the range. The problem, of course, is that when we have an influx of these birds, sometimes we don't know whether it's a Florida female or a Chesapeake Bay male, and so we get those types of overlaps in size. Yeah. But here you can see that. This is a picture that somebody took here at the Botanical Gardens. Who was that, Dwayne or someone took this picture? It was from several years ago. But you can see the differences, and I'm sure you see that in the webcam all the time, that when the two birds are together, you can see characteristics that indicate males and females. The females tend to have larger, thicker necks. They're heavier bodied overall, and you can see that in flight. The males tend to have a sleeker proportion to them. The proportions are different, not just the weight. Other differences. You all were just talking about some of the squabbles between males and females. Typically, for most of the pairs that we have, the females are completely dominant to the males, and they completely control the nest. Oftentimes, when you see males, and we have thousands of hours of video that we've done, I'll show you some results from that. But oftentimes, the male is the provider of fish, particularly in the first 2 weeks of development for the chicks. After the point where the chicks can thermoregulate on their own, the female will oftentimes help with the hunting responsibilities. And oftentimes, you'll get a dud male, where the female, he's just not a good provider. Some of these males that we have recorded, are producing like 90% of the food that comes into the nest, and they're incredible providers. But occasionally you'll get a dud male, and they're not providing food. The female is stuck there incubating or brooding chicks, which is, she does a lot of the responsibility in those particular roles, particularly early in the nesting cycle. And you get a dud male, and she eventually has to decide whether she can continue to brood the chicks or go off and get food that they need to be provided for. We had a case, there was a nest in Richmond this year where that male was clearly a dud. The female was then stuck between having to go out and having to brood the chicks, and that nest was broken up because of that. A few years ago, we were videotaping a nest on the lower James, and the male was lost, and the female eventually had to go out and get food for the chicks, and an intruder came in and ate the chicks. And so the female has a particular role to play, and the male has a particular role to play, particularly early in development, and both of them need to be competent in those roles. The reason that you saw the male taking sort of the fish is that he oftentimes gets the short end of the stick. Oftentimes the males will bring in fish, the female will take that repeatedly, and the male doesn't get any food. So oftentimes when she's not there guarding the food, he'll sneak, pieces of that fish. Okay. And this cycle I think you're familiar with. We can see nest building at any time of the year, but there's an intensification of nest building beginning really typically at this latitude at about mid-October. And that intensity tends to wane in about mid-February when most of the laying has occurred. Incubation, as you know, is about 35 days, and we can get incubation within this range here. The past week or so, I've been looking at a lot of data that we have. We have brood ages so that I can backdate incubation or clutch initiation dates on about 3,000 nesting attempts. And I have been looking at the phenology over the past week or so for a paper. But this is about what we see here. This is relevant to management, of course, because it's important to put disturbance buffers in terms of time of year. One of the areas that we know least about is the post-fledging dependence period, and that's the reason why we've been putting transmitters on chicks, is to understand this part of their ecology, which is one of the parts that we know the least about. We have put transmitters now on, I think, 24 chicks in the bay. All of which have survived to fledging, all of which have survived to a couple of years of age. And so we're intensively studying this particular period because we don't know much about it at all. And it turns out that it varies quite a bit. We have chicks in the upper bay that have stayed on the territory for as long as 4 to 6 months. We have other chicks that have dispersed from the territory within a period of 3 weeks or so. So it seems to vary quite a bit. And this is a picture that Reese sent to me some years ago, and this is typically the sign, as I'm sure you're familiar, that's sort of the end of the nest building. Nest is built in a particular way, and oftentimes the lining is added last. So typically when you start to see lining coming into the nest, that typically indicates that they're getting close to the laying period. Of course, as you know, lining material can be brought in throughout the nesting season and sort of refreshing the lining as well. But that's something that when you see that in January or so, you know that the pair is really getting serious about laying.